Well, let's get this started. You guys can at least talk a little bit about yourselves and introduce yourselves to everybody while John gets here. Thanks for being here. I put together a panel. I'm really fortunate. Sometimes you do these panels and the folks are chosen for you, but I was able to choose these guys, and I know them all. Jeremy less than the other three, but Jeremy and I did a webinar for ADI a couple of months ago, so you may know that name. But anyway, starting with Dan the man here, why don't we just give a little short bio of everybody? Oh yeah, we got two. We got a Dan and a Daniel. So
I'm going to go by Daniel.
Well, I'm sorry to inform you, Rob Cordes, who is an absolute genius and my marketing director and has been since we started the business. He was actually part of the business before. He did all my pro bono work for the first 10 years of the business. He has a family emergency and can't be here today, so he asked me to sit in. But he's passed along all of his genius to me for the next hour, hopefully. I'm with Garrison Brothers Distillery.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Murrell. I'm with Morpheus Brand Consulting. Prior to this, I spent 20 years working on global marketing teams at Brown-Forman. So I worked on brands like Jack and Woodford and Old Forester.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Daniel. I've got a feeling you won't mix me up with Dan, given my accent. But I have a history of working with Pernod Ricard for 10 years on big brands and small brands. But now I'm an independent consultant working across the industry in many capacities.
So I want to posit this question to you. I talk to people all the time, and they talk about the brand they've built. And sometimes they're a year old, 2 years old, 6 months old. Sometimes they haven't even put anything in a bottle yet.
Get your ass up here, Little.
John Little, everybody. So I'll do the bio for him. John and I started Smooth Ambler together in 2009, sold the business in 2017 to Pernod Ricard, which is what triggered the relationship with Daniel and his marketing expertise. And now JL is a man about town, consultant, trash talker. And we bought some hats yesterday at Paris Hatters. Anyway, anything else you want to add to that, JL?
Great, thanks.
All right. That's all good. So a lot of people say they've built a brand when really they've created a brand. So let's talk about, I'd like to hear from all of you real quickly about the difference between building a brand and the strategic practice of brand building over the life of that brand, once you get it started. We can start with you, Daniel, because I know you have an opinion on this.
So I think the starting point is always strategic intent. Building any brand these days is complex. It requires patience and it requires pockets, especially in this industry. So I think it's really important to know why you're going into this. And there's many motivations. Some people kind of fall into it. It can be more of a vanity project, to be honest. Some people go in with a much more strategic and deliberate objective of creating a brand. Whatever your motivation is, that's fine. Just be honest about it, because I think it will absolutely affect how you go about the brand building process, the level of depth, the amount of investment. So be clear on your strategic intent would be my first thought.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think, Daniel, that's right. And I would say the most important thing about understanding your brand is figuring out why do people care, or why should people care. So a lot of times it's, we have the story down pat in terms of our mash bill, our aging process. Those are great stories and that's part of it. But finding out what makes you relevant in a world of brands. So what is it about the consumer? What is it about culture that makes your brand connect and stand out and give a reason for people to care about it? That gives you a leg up on other brands who are maybe just looking at more of that functional benefit of what they're adding and what you get when you buy a bottle.
My branding started with the business plan. When I was writing the business plan, I had to create a mission statement, and my mission statement was simple and direct and cocky as hell. It said, we're going to make the finest tasting, highest quality bourbon whiskey in the world. Once you state that and you put it on paper, and every employee that comes to work for you has to agree with that mission statement, it's a pretty good starting point. It's a good way to get grounded and know what we're going to be and what we're going to do. The next line after that said, we're also going to have a swagger, and we're going to show the rest of the world that bourbon can be made all over the United States of America, not just in Kentucky. And we're going to do it with a cockiness, and we're going to get so far out in front of everybody that they'll never catch us.
Yeah. Wow, I'm kind of in between these two things, which is certainly what started this was making sure that you have a clear mission of what your brand's going to be. And then Dan, you can probably tell, Dan, that's some gusto. I always tell craft distillers, if they think that they're going to make a bourbon that tastes better than Buffalo Trace 2 years into making bourbon, then you're wrong. You're not going to make whiskey that tastes that good 2 years into it. It takes a long time to learn how to do that. And of course, it takes a while for that product to age to maturity. So what you need to create is have a clear vision of that gap that you're going to fill. Why is someone going to buy that product from you? Is it a local story? Is there some audience that you are tying yourself to? I see that I think is done very well with some military brands and some, obviously different segments. But you have to have a clear vision of why you think somebody is going to buy your product and what gap you're going to fill for your product, why someone is going to be that. It might be a unique flavor. It might be a different audience. It might be package, whatever that is. But you have to have a really clear vision of why that brand's going to work and why somebody is going to stop drinking what they're drinking now and drink something that you make. Because that's one of the things that you will be heartbroken, is that you will be heartbroken when the people in your backyard and the people that you care the most about and you've given your life to create these brands and spent so much time that they're going to drink. They're going to still go in there, no criticism of the Maker's Mark, but they're going to go in there and order a Maker's Mark and ginger ale because that's what they've been ordering for 20 years. It's what their mother drank or their father drank or their boyfriend or their girlfriend drank. And you're their best friend and you got a distillery that you just spent $5 million building and put whiskey in a bottle and you walk into the bar and they've ordered Maker and ginger. So you got to have a clear understanding of why they're going to do that and then how you're going to change that behavior. It's not only what gap are you filling, how are you going to change the behavior from what they're currently doing to what you would like to see them do in the future?
And maybe to build on that, I mean, I really see a brand in two halves. There's the product side of the brand that John just talked about, actually. And then there's the emotional side of the brand and everything that it's going to bring them, which is the kind of intangible. And in a category that is so wildly competitive and fragmented, you need to do a good job with the product side. But I'd say you need to do a better job with the emotional side.
But to your point, that is exactly what Dan is talking about. Dan's gusto, his pride in Texas, the fact that I've never seen Dan without a hat. So the fact that he's not coming in here looking like he's from Texas with his hat on, having this big Texas ego, and I don't mean that as a criticism, I mean that as a point of pride. Like when when he walked in there, he was talking about Texas-made whiskey. We were proud to drink it. That is as much shit. That might be 80% of an emotional connection to the brand that Dan and Garrison was creating. It was all about that from the get-go, right? That was something that everybody should emulate. Not the same thing, because there's only one of those, right? But to create some emotional connection to the brand.
Absolutely, because almost everybody in this, you shouldn't go into this industry unless you think your product is of high quality, tastes good, tastes unique, tastes smooth. But I haven't told you anything there that everybody's going to try and claim that, right? So what are you going to differentiate on? You're probably going to struggle to differentiate on product. Not saying you shouldn't have a great product, you should. But you can create a distinctive brand based on this emotional connection. And Garrison Brothers is a great example, the whole Texas heritage and the mission and the vision behind that.
Jeremy, you talked about relevance. Once a brand satisfies themselves, however they go about that they've found that point of relevance, now how do you go find or how do you successfully target the customers to whom that relevance will matter? So you've got this and you've got the voice, you've got that emotional thing. What's the dividing rod for going out? And I'd like to hear from all of you, but I'm going to start with Jeremy because he sort of touched on it. What's the dividing rod for finding the customers to whom you expect that relevance to be important?
Yeah, I think when we start talking about customers and consumers, we start to default to a demographic lens. So we're targeting a certain age group or a certain gender or maybe even a certain generation. That's part of it, but what I've seen be the most effective is the reason that your brand exists. You've developed that idea. What's the mindset of the people who are open to that proposition? So start with a mindset, and I'll share an example from my past of working on Jack. When we talked about consumers, we talked about them as independent spirits, and they're people who like to live life on their own terms. So we weren't talking about a demographic at all, but we were talking about a mindset because we knew that what the brand has to offer will resonate with people who feel that way and people who aspire to feel that way. Because think about this category. This is a category, and we talked about it, Daniel, you mentioned it. This is an emotional category. People make emotional decisions. People use your brands as a badge in some instance because it says something about them. Those are the brands that win, the ones that are able to target that mindset, find people who believe in the same things that the brand is, they're open to that proposition. That's where the magic happens. So if you can get your story and understand the purpose of your brand and then be able to find people who believe in the same thing and have that same mindset, they're more likely to choose your brand. Then at that point, now you can get into some of the details around demographics or other specifics about people, because now you're getting into media targeting. So where do I go tell my story? And I know I was in Justin's presentation yesterday with Bevfluence, where he was talking about if you're trying to get on the radar of anyone under the age of 30 to 21, somewhere in that LDA, younger drinking age, you have to be on TikTok probably, or you have to be on social media. You have to be able to tell those stories. And now that you know the mindset, you know what your brand's about, now you have an effective way to go tell the story, right? That starts to also help you understand, what do we say? What's our tone of voice? What kind of attitude do we have? With just Dan telling the story about Garrison, I can already see, the messaging for that brand. It's got that attitude and that vibe to it. So I would just say, find the mindset. Once you know your brand, understand the mindset of that person that's also open to that proposition, and then that's where those connections start to happen.
Early on, we targeted the influencers. With bourbon, there's fanatics out there. Y'all know it. I mean, people that are into bourbon are really into bourbon. They have entire walls in their houses that are covered with bourbon bottles. And we went right for the heart of that market. We said, we're going to have to win them over first. If we win them over, guys like Chuck Cowdery, Fred Minnick, Wade Woodard, they were all on Bourbon Straight sending out, messages in the middle of the night about what they were drinking that night and what they liked and what they didn't like. And when I found Bourbon Straight, I went, oh, this is a perfect medium for me to communicate my message. And I recruited them, and I brought Chuck Cowdery down to my distillery like 3 times just to spend a couple of days drinking with us and making bourbon. Same thing with Wade Woodard and some other folks, and getting them on board and them believing that you might really pull this bullshit off was the best part of it, because there were so many doubters out there. To have the influencers saying, hey, Garrison seems to know what he's doing a little bit. To have them just say that was enough for me to get into the marketplace. And then we formed what we call the Old 300, which is our ambassador association. It's 300 families from all over the United States, not just from Texas. And we join, and they get to come to Bourbon Camp twice a year at Garrison Brothers Distillery. And at Bourbon Camp, we dance and we sing, and we teach them how to distill. We teach them how to ferment mash. We teach them every part of the process, from filling the barrels to proofing the barrels. And they get to go take a drill into the barn and drill a hole in a barrel and take a little sample off of it, and then write up their own personal notes on what they're tasting. And so we created this cadre of people that really wanted to be part of the team, and that helped.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Thanks, John. Couple of points. I'd say when you're starting out, target much more tightly than widely. And I think it's a common mistake. If you think your target is 29 to 50-year-old kind of millennials who are into whiskey, it probably is, along with every other whiskey brand that's in America. So that's not helpful. How to maybe think about this? Sometimes I find it useful to think about it in reverse, how you're actually going to access these people. And what happens when you buy modern day media is these companies will send you, they'll try and ask you for the profile of person. And they go out and ask these people, what are their interests and how do they spend their time and all the rest of it. And the more you can actually distill down and target a more focused group of people, the better chance you have of actually accessing those people. And the more detailed profile. That's the first thing. The second thing is you won't get it right first time around. And that's okay. Keep iterating and keep iterating. You can only iterate if you've gone kind of focused and then you make a slight adjustment and say, well, maybe we need to go a bit heavier on that kind of independent mindset. And we're going to target people, I don't know, who are heavy, not just into outdoor sports, but I don't know, rock climbing, for example. Probably hundreds of thousands of people in this country into rock climbing. At least you've got a focus. At least you can go after those people. You know which influencers you're going to go target to access those people. You know which media you're going to target. It gives you a focus. If you're too wide, it's, unless you have really deep pockets, that's the game the big brands are playing. If you're a small brand, be focused.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Daniel. The amount of data that is obviously available now is much different than what was available in 2010, right? Certainly, we were not as prescriptive as in 2009, 2010 as we were in 2024 at Smooth Ambler. We just didn't have access to the same level of data. So we started off with a bold thing, which was we were going after that. We coined this term pretty early, which was called the urban suburban, right? Somebody who wants to have a platinum F-250, somebody who wants to have a Benelli shotgun or buy $100 pair of jeans instead of going and getting a pair of Levi's. We wanted somebody who found value in something that they were a Yeti cooler, right? Somebody that found value in something specific as opposed to doing something more generic, right? We all know people who would buy a pair of Levi's and then drive a platinum F-250 or save a bunch of money doing one thing, but maybe buy a $3,000 shotgun. That was our point. So we were trying to find those people. That becomes very hard. We thought we were doing something really good, but we didn't have enough targeted information to find out exactly who all that customer was. And that changed over the years as we started more clearly defining that demographic. And very much to Daniel's point, you take a shot at what you think your best chance is, and then you use all of that data. Obviously, every quarter. I think any less than that is everybody's just shotgunning, has a shotgun approach. But about every quarter, we would try to renew that focus and see if we were getting feedback. A lot of it was just, is it affecting, if we were doing targeted media in a market, is it affecting model sales? Do we see any change in our engagement if we're going after those people on social media? So over the years, certainly we got more information based off of our marketing efforts.
And just so we don't scare people, I mean, to be clear, when we say you or we, it's the agencies. I mean, you're going to have help doing this. All those like Meta and everyone who sells you ad space, they have all the analytics. Part of their job is to help inform how you can be more effective. And even if you take on the smaller social media agencies, they will present you a dashboard each month, and you should hold them accountable for making recommendations of how we do better. So you don't have to understand all of this in depth, but you do have to be in the driving seat enough to hold those accountable to say, we want to be focused. What's the next iteration look like? How do we create more efficiency? How do we get better? That's your job. Their job is to figure out the nuts and bolts.
What do you think, talking about pitfalls, and I'll start with you, Daniel, what do you think is what is a crucial foundational building block that brands either undervalue or completely skip over in your experience, and John and I can name 2 or 3 of these probably that we did, but what do you see over and over again that people are missing that they just shouldn't miss? What ball should people be keeping their eye on that they seem just not to on a regular basis?
I mean, not to beat the same drum, but the number one thing people skip over is work on the target. If you ask me, often they have a very clear idea of the brand and what the name could be and what the product could be. You have no idea who they're really targeting. And that becomes the pitfall, because when you get to the final part of the marketing equation, which is telling your target about your wonderful brand and product, if you haven't done the work on the target, you're just going to be sprinkling marketing dollars into the ether. And unfortunately, you probably won't see very much return. So I think, as I said, beating the same drum, but the target is probably the number one thing people don't pay enough attention to.
Yeah.
I've got a feeling you're nodding.
No, you're spot on. And I think part of that too is it's target, and I think it's also brand, because your brand story, but how are you communicating to others, and how are you arming the people who are selling the brand on your behalf to tell the story that you want them to tell? And it's a process similar to the distillation process, or similar to the process that we go through with TTB to get approvals. I mean, there is a process to it to help you work through the details on that, and putting in that same effort to really understand who is your target, who am I as a brand, what's happening in my target's world that I can either help them fight for, or fight against, or rally around, that's going to make me relevant, that people I'm not targeting are going to find attractive, that will find me as that word starts to spread. That's a process in and of itself. So, spending the time and effort to make sure that how you want your brand to show up, how you want others to sell your brand on your behalf is super important, to make sure that you just put in the time and effort to do that.
And you have to be confident in your brand. You have to believe in it 100%. And one of the smartest things I did, I'm not a very smart guy, but I did do a couple of steps. It was pretty smart. I sent off 12 bottles to a company in California called ETS Labs, and they analyzed the content of the juice inside these bottles. But I picked 12 bottles. One of them was Garrison Brothers small batch bourbon whiskey, and one was an experimental that we were working on called Cowboy Bourbon. And we put them in unmarked bottles. They were labeled number 1 through 12, but nobody knew what was in it. So one of the bottles had Jack Daniels in it. One of the bottles had Makers in it. One of them had Pappy Van Winkle 23-year-old. And every single bottle, I was the only one who knew what numbers corresponded to what brand was actually in that bottle. And they did spider graphs to tell me what the oak volatiles that were in the product. And they sent them back to me on every single product, because I'm not going to take something to market if I could kill somebody, right? What if it's all methanol? And what if people that are drinking Garrison Brothers are dying? And so I had to have it tested and get the methanol levels. I had to know. And we kicked ass on every single Kentucky bourbon. We had just trace amounts of methanol or butyl alcohol in it at all. And I said, well, then hell, let's go to market. And that was kind of the stepping point for us. But I was totally confident that my bourbon was healthy and was not going to hurt anybody. And so I was, waving the flag.
Wow, Johnny said we had a couple of things that we could talk about as mistakes. We all, if it had brands in here, there's more than a few things that you can talk about the mistakes. I think one of the things early on is a very clearly defined, so much like maybe call it an elevator pitch. I think often about how little we're actually in the market in comparison to how often a distributor is in the market. So as sad as that might make everybody in this room, right? Our distributors are the faces of our brand in our absence. Do they clearly share? Do they clearly understand, and can they adequately share your brand story to understand its strength or weakness in your absence? Right? They're never going to do it as good as you can do it. But is it simple enough, and do you have a clearly defined story so that they can share that message? I often think about how little time we have when we are in front of our customer, whether that's a retailer, or whether that's on premise or off premise, or whether that's the actual end user. And so we often found that we made a little of this and a little of that, and we had a small batch and a single barrel, and we had a blend, and we had some stuff we sourced. Like that's a really complicated story for somebody to sell. For us, we live it. For everybody in this room, we live it, and we understand it like the back of our hands. But can the people that are selling your product for you, i.e. distributors, or the retailer, or even the customer, can they understand all of that? The more simple you make that story, some of that is just storytelling, some branding. Some of that is the way, how many SKUs you have, right? How simply can that message be shared amongst everybody? How simply can you tell your story? And if it's the same story as somebody else's, that doesn't always work either. Having a really cool grain to glass distillery where it's all non-GMO grain, whatever it is. Like a lot of people are telling that story. So how do you separate yourself from that with this clearly defined story that everybody else can share? And I frequently see brands that get into muddy water where that's not so easily understood. And especially as their SKUs expand and they have a much bigger portfolio, that it continues to get muddier and muddier. And then maybe as their sales peak, it sort of starts to go the other way because it's just a hard story to tell as opposed to brands that have 1 or 2 or 3 SKUs. And I see that from a branding side, and I see that from this marketing and brand story side as well, that everything just starts to get muddier. And I think you've got to be really clear about what that story is.
So this is the perfect time to bring this up. And Daniel, I say this with tons of love and humor in my heart. We began to work with Daniel when Smooth Ambler was 7, 8, 9 years old. And it is infuriating to be told by someone that your ship isn't as tight as you think it is. I wanted to strangle I went to John. I'm like, do we know somebody that has a farm on the outside of town where we can? But so let's talk about that. And that John, you gave me the perfect segue. If you've done everything right and you started to get going, how there's got to be multiple ways to stress test it. To stress test your story, your brand vision, because it's easy to not smell what we're all shoveling every now and then. And so how often should that happen? What are some ways to make that happen? Obviously, marketing guys like you and Jeremy can help. How do you do it, Dan, independently? I'm sure you guys probably did that with some market help, but also just circling the wagons at Garrison Brothers. And so how do you stress test once you think you're on the path that you should be on?
Again, first of all, you've got to be flexible as a founder and put V1 out there and be opening to tightening things and listening. And in this industry, there's so many stakeholders. You have the end consumer and the shopper. You have the customer, what we typically refer to as the retailer. You have the distributor. You might have a broker. You might have your own sales force. And it's a lot to navigate, first of all. But secondly, these are all voices in your brand. And I think just by listening to them and doing something as simple as going on a ride along and listening to how the distributor may pitch your brand to a retailer, that tells you the piece of the messaging that's getting through, dare I say it, to the lowest common denominator. And if that messaging doesn't, resonate with you, then you need to, fix it somehow. And there's 2 ways to fix it. You can keep kind of beating on the same drum and trying to educate those people, or you might take a cue from them and say, oh, I never thought about presenting my brand like that. Maybe that's something we should look at and pivot a little bit. To your point about timing, I mean, if you change your strategy too often, you don't have a strategy, right? You all know that. But I think, you need to be open to constantly listening and then making those pivots. And if you really want to hold me accountable to a timing, I mean, every 1 to 2 years, take a check step, take a moment, take a beat to actually think about where is this all going? Is the messaging working? But definitely, you don't want to be changing things week to week. That would be bad.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Daniel. I think sometimes we want to tell the whole story, but lead with the most important part of the story. So start there, and then also keep it simple. I have two 13-year-old twin boys at home. So in past work, I've actually said, hey, when I say this to you, what does that mean? Just to see if they can understand what it is. And one of my favorite examples of that is with Liquid Death and their tagline of "Murder Your Thirst." And when you hear that, you're like, okay, well, it's something that helps me quench thirst. All right. It has the word murder in it, so that's pretty aggressive, right? So I get some vibe and feel of what the brand is trying to communicate to me. But I think that's, and that's a tagline, but I do think it's a good example of how they've said, this is what our brand is about. And this is who we are. This is the benefit that we deliver. And if you like it, great. And if you don't, that's okay too. So I think if you can lead with the most important part of your story that gives you the ability to tell more of the story as people are interested, so you gain that interest. And then for that important part, just keep it simple, because you might only have one or two sentences with someone that you can do that. And then, Dan, what you had mentioned earlier is make sure that everyone who touches the brand can tell that same story once you've figured that part out, to make sure that there's no guessing about what that brand's about.
We had two different lines that we tested in multiple types of mediums. One line was, yeah, it's expensive, but it's worth every damn penny. I've already told you it's expensive. Now you're going to buy it anyway? That's on you. That's not on me anymore. I told you it was expensive, right? So everybody always said that nobody's ever going to buy a $100 bottle of bourbon. Tillman Fertitta, the CEO and president of Landry's Restaurant Corp., told me to my face, nobody's ever going to buy a $100 bottle of bourbon from Texas. He's now my largest customer nationwide. And he also is the ambassador to Italy, and he just went over to the embassy in Rome and requested that I send him 5 barrels of our bourbon so he can give out the bottles to dignitaries who come to the American embassy over there. So the second great line that I use during tastings, when people come up to my table and they want to take a little sample, I'll hand it to them and I'll say, hey, before you drink that, just know you're going to really like it. And I don't want you to like it too much because it's damned expensive. You get in the mind of the customer and you're challenging them to spend that much money on that bottle. And that's been pretty successful for us. That's the elevator pitch.
I love it. Love it. I think Dan's done a good job on that. And I think listening to all, as Daniel mentioned, listening to all of your shareholders, all of the stakeholders in your business, again, from the people that you work with every day, to your distributors, to your retailers, to your customers, and listening to all those shareholders and taking all of that in. Not all of that feedback is going to be good. I mean, if you get a review online and somebody says this is dog shit, that's not useful. Right? It's not useful. It's you take useful information and use it feedback. I'm not suggesting you change who you are. You should have a foundation of your business, and that is who you believe you are and what you believe the brand stands for. We're not suggesting changing that. We're suggesting taking feedback that is useful and reviewing it every couple of months, whether that's data or whether that's opinions on the products, or go to the retailers, look at it on the shelf, ask the retailers, how does the customer interpret their product? How do they interpret product? Do they know what the benefits of those things are? And do those, I hate the word survey because it's becomes such an official term in the corporate world where you go and have this very formal thing. I'm suggesting at least an informal meeting with all of those people and use that feedback to more accurately target your customer. Do people understand your label? Do they understand what hang tags mean are they effective? If you're putting hang tags on your bottle to talk about awards, does the retailer just pull them off? So it's a nonstop effort of what do you think happens at the distillery and what is actually happening at the consumer level, and then be willing to adjust all of that. I think that feedback is really, really important. And unfortunately, it's not always what you want to hear, because you take such pride in your product and you spent so much effort in it, and then somebody tells you it didn't work, it doesn't taste the way you want it to, it's not being perceived the way it is. So I think being amenable to change outside of who you think you are and outside of changing the very foundations of your business is a really wonderful thing. So,
and that consumer that sent you the email that said it tastes like shit, probably sent it to you between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning after bottle number 2.
So
The next morning, they won't even remember it.
So Daniel was talking about feedback, and you just hit on it. I'm gonna put you on the spot, John. Do you remember the 4 tenets of Basque that we used to talk about?
The 4/10 what?
The 4 tenets of Basque.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, talk about that just for a minute, because I think it's important. It speaks to feedback and brand pivotability in a way.
My father-in-law told me the Basque people had 4 tenets, which are show up, pay attention, speak the truth without blame or guilt, and be open to results. And so those became kind of tenets of Smooth Ambler, which those were the things that we always did. So it's hard to always hear that and to be open to all of those things, but those are kind of tenets that we use inside of Smooth Ambler, and we tried to use that to. Oh, you don't always do that. You don't always want to be open to things, but certainly that became a big part of our business.
Dan, you had a thought?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in this day and age, it's also really important to be honest and transparent about your brand. Consumers and all those stakeholders we mentioned have the ability at their fingertips to research anything about everything, okay? So, number 1, never lie. Number 2, if you think you have something which is, quote, a weakness, think how it can be reframed into a strength. By the way, distributors are notorious at coming at you for, in Smooth Ambler's case, you don't have your own distillery. It's sourced liquid. Well, it is sourced liquid. How do you reframe that into a positive? Example, yes, we proudly source and we get to pick the best liquid from all over America. Dan was probably attacked in the beginning. Oh, bourbon from Texas? What the fuck is that? Okay. And probably can come up with 5 reasons why bourbon from Texas not only holds its own against Kentucky, but probably has to fight against the elements even more strongly to create more characterful and flavorful bourbon, for example. So there's a way to reframe. I guess my message is never lie, take what you have and make the best of it. Because I guarantee you, if you think long and hard enough about it, there's always a positive spin on what somebody may perceive as a weakness in your brand, and you can turn it into a positive.
And Daniel, can I add to that? Because it reminds me of the idea too that tension is good.
Yes.
So if you're trying to be a brand for everybody and try to be everything to everybody, that's not going to work, because then no one knows what you're really about. So having that attitude and having that of this is what we believe, this is who we are, the people who have that will find you. And that's even more attractive, and it's even more aspirational for a lot of people, because they may not be in that position right now where they're like, yeah, that's, I'm there.
Yeah, there's a whole slew of people who go looking for stuff that's off the normal.
Exactly. And just think about the best books, the best movies, the best media. There is tension there, and that's why they're the best. So don't be afraid of that. Lean into it, be transparent, find out what your thing's about, and then be comfortable with the fact that not everyone's going to like you. And that's okay, because the ones who do, they will love you, and they will tell others about how much they love you.
I want to get into some Q&A while we got a little time left. But just to set the record straight, we did have a distillery. We just also sourced liquid. Sorry. No. Just, it's in my DNA to make that distinction for all the obvious reasons. All right. Questions, anybody? Nobody has a question for these 4 wise men? Yeah, go for it.
Should I tell you first?
Yeah.
The obvious answer is how long is a piece of string? So the way I tend to approach this now is think about how much money you have and the most efficient use of that money. It's almost impossible to do it backwards. Okay. If you're a massive brand, you can do it backwards. But as a small brand, if the reality is you have, I don't know, $5,000 a month, $2,000 a month, well, that's your reality. Fine. So what do you need to do? You need to be focused about how you spread those dollars, A, in terms of tactics, and B, in terms of geography. I think the number one mistake people make is they don't go tight on geography. I think it's much better to focus that money in a smaller geographical area than sprinkle it, pennies around the country. And secondly, think about what tactics are going to have the most impact according to your brand life cycle. So if you're just starting out, what's the big obvious things? No one knows your brand. No one heard of your brand, and no one's tasted your brand. So honestly, I'd put money into those two things. Tasting is fairly obvious. And then in terms of kind of awareness, is it social media? Is it on shelf? I mean, I think honestly, when you're starting out, shelf talkers is probably one of the best investments you can make. So keeping it simple, keeping it focused.
And finding a balance of long and short term. So short term in terms of what is it that you can do, which is more of your tasting experience of catching people in the moment who might be interested in buying that bottle. But also keep in mind that not everyone's ready to buy at the same time. So constantly remind the ability in the long term to remind people that you're there, just gently tapping them on the shoulder to say, hey, I'm available, I'm here. That will over time, that will help you drive profitability because it will just build that shortcut with people that they're going to remember you. The brands that they come in contact with in more places more often are going to have a better chance of being pulled off the shelf. So, but it's a balance as well. Sometimes you've got to have that in the moment. We're generating short-term cash, so let's do some more activation and do some promotion, in an account. But don't lose the long-term profitability with focusing too much on that short-term sale.
Daniel's point, but both those points are excellent. I think of it three things, and I preach them whether people want to hear them or not, mostly not. But deep is always better than wide. I've preached it to every single distillery that opens up. Like Daniel said, go as deep and you're close to your market as humanly possible, right? As good as you can. Liquid to lips is really important. Let people taste that thing. Taste your product as much as you possibly can. And it's easier in some markets than in others, obviously, but as many times. And nobody tells the brand story like you, right? So those three things, as much as you can do those three things, I mean, at some point in time, all of those things cost money. Some of them, early on, your time is worth not much, right? I mean, because you might not have the funds to be able to pay somebody else to do it. And again, they can't tell the story as well as you can early on, probably. And so being out, every brand that I know that has been successful, whether you're talking about Dan's business or Bullet, or there's a friend back in the back right here who has a distillery in North Carolina, nobody can tell their story as good as they can tell their story. And so it'd be impossible for you to pay somebody probably on a normal budget. So unfortunately, you're just going to be ground into the with always being in the market and always being in front of somebody.
When you're getting started, social media is your best friend. Period.
Sure. So in my opinion, especially if you're a small to mid-size, call it a regional player. I'm going to use Smooth Ambler as an example, but I think many of the distilleries, craft distilleries that are out here have similar stories, which are the further you go outside of your market, the less important or the more diluted your story becomes, generally speaking, right? Especially in the early days of craft when you were like, we're a grain to glass distillery and we buy grain from 30 minutes away and we use this tiny little local farmer. I think the further you get away from that, the more diluted that story becomes. But the goal is to be in, call it for us, maybe a 4-hour radius of West Virginia. That's still a lot of territory. That includes, call it DC and Pittsburgh and Charlotte and whatever. But we tried to focus within a 4-hour range of where we were because the story was more impactful. We could travel there more often at a lower cost. We're not spreading marketing dollars. And I hear these craft distilleries, small brands, whether they're craft distilleries or not, but small brands who after a year are in 40 markets, that gets really diluted really fast. To Daniel's point, I think it was, where you're spending pennies in each individual market instead of spending thousands of dollars at a very focused, targeted market in your backyard, I think is unwise spend, especially early on. And it's one thing if you've got a $10 million marketing plan and you're going to go out and you've got a celebrity endorsement, say, maybe that'd be $20 million these days, and you've got a big spread about that and you've got a great distribution network. But when you're growing and you want to be able to drive to your distributors and drive to your retailers and go and do pourings and tastings, that gets really expensive when you're trying to fly everywhere and you're going everywhere. So hit that business in your backyard. Somebody that I think about often, and I don't know them, so I might be speaking out of turn. I have always been super impressed with what Cedar Ridge has done. I think they are still the number one bourbon in Iowa. So they're what formerly was a craft distillery, and they own their backyard. And that to me is maybe one of the most impressive things that anybody has done in the 20 years in this business, if they have made it a priority to focus on Iowa corn and owning their backyard. And what a great sense of pride that must be for them and for all of the citizens, bourbon drinkers in Iowa, that an Iowa brand is controlling that market. So that to me is kind of what I think about, owning your backyard.
Dan, you want the final word? And we're going to cut these people loose.
Can't say it better than that. When I moved outside of Texas, I almost went bankrupt. It was the stupidest move I ever made, because I hadn't really penetrated Texas like I could have. So we retreated and we brought all our brands back away from the distributors and moved back to Texas.
Gents, thanks for being here, being on the panel. All of you, thanks for showing up and being here. Have a great rest of the conference, and see you tonight.